new any new participant may join us after we have started. So let me welcome all the attendees to this webinar. This is the series that CMRS has started uh, after the pandemic broke out. CMRS normally has a series of seminars, monthly seminars for the Cairo community, in which speakers address migration issues and refugee issues, uh, having to respect the distancing norm under the pandemic. We have decided to launch this series, and we are very pleased that this, I think, is it the third or fourth webinar, probably fourth or even fifth webinar. So we are, in any case, we are very pleased to welcome as a speaker in, in this webinar, today's webinar, to welcome Dr. Nada Al-Qouni. Dr. Al-Qouni will talk to us today about infrastructures of mobility, rural transnational migration, and social mobilization in Egypt's Nile Delta. Many concepts in the title. I personally look forward to an analysis of this subject for the webinar, and look forward also to the substance that we listen to from Nada. Nada has recently um, finished and um, graduated as a doctor in anthropology from Rutgers University, and the talk today is part of her thesis. It is part of the research that she conducted, field research that she conducted in order to write a thesis. At CMRS, we are very fortunate that right, and even before she had completely, she had even defended, I think you had not defended yet, Nada, when you joined CMRS. In any case, we are very happy that Nada joined us, joined CMRS as a research manager. This is her first job after she got her PhD. Nada is a research manager in a project that we have at CMRS, a project funded by the United Kingdom Research Fund. It is about South-South migration, inequality, and development, and she is responsible for two work packages that are closely related to the subject, in fact, to the subject of the talk to which we listen today. I have gone for too long. I will give the floor to Nada now to do her presentation, after which the floor will be open to the attendees to raise questions, to make some comments, after which I may probably have a few comments to make myself, and then Nada will be given the floor again to reply, to respond, to express further ideas and further observations. Having said that, I give the floor to Nada for a presentation which I hope will be between 30 and 40 minutes. Nada, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahim, and thank you, CMRS, for inviting me. I'm very glad to share my work with the center and with everybody attending, and hopefully get some useful and things engagement, to engage and have things to think about moving forward with kind of thinking about specifically the migration aspect of my dissertation. So I'll just share a screen. Um, Sorry, it's different. Okay. So um, I just to give you some context about how this developed, or what I'm talking about today has developed. So it's derived from a chapter from my dissertation, which I recently defended. The whole chapter, as I said, was not migration focused, but this specific chapter very much deals with migration, which is the talk my dissertation is based on today. And the dissertation at large was titled Mediating Political Subjectivities, Infrastructure, Mobility, and Social Action in Egypt's Nile Delta. So I'm very interested in thinking about social and material and physical infrastructures, but very much, when we talk about physical infrastructures like road building, like bridges, like, working for sewage networks, how very much these shape citizens' engagement with the state, and they define very much also, for example, when a village steps in to provide these lacking infrastructures itself, what this means about the role of citizens and what this means about the role of the state, and specifically also shifting from the kind of the shape of the state from the 50s till today, which is kind of also a historical analysis that I talk about when the state is used to providing this kind of patronage role, as opposed to when it kind of recedes and does not do that, how do citizens fill in? And mobility is another main theme, which I'll get more into today. And social action is thinking about the different forms of um, mobilization incentives in villages around providing these, for example, lacking infrastructures. So to situate where I will be talking about today and the two main sites that I worked in, the first is in Al Bahira Governorate, Gira village, and Bahira is on the left of the map. And the second village, Tasnim village, which is in Al Dakhliya Governorate on the right of the map, and they're about 185 kilometers apart and about the same distance to the south, which is Cairo, about 150 also. And so they're in the Nile Delta region. And just to, as a note, the village names are not the real names, they're pseudonyms. And also any names that I will mention are also pseudonyms of research interlocutors that I refer to. So for example, to give you a brief background, the first village in Dakhliya was a new village. And by new village, this means it was created during President Nasser's 1950s land reform and new land settlements. So land reclamation. These new settlements that were created allowed farmers to settle there. They built them homes, gave them land tenancy over lands to cultivate at very low costs. And the agricultural yield would be used by the agricultural cooperatives and as a way to kind of support the agricultural economy in Egypt. And farmers in return received these social benefits like land ownership and homes to live in, and basic infrastructures built like a school. And so the village today is about 3,000 members. So it's a pretty small village for Egyptian standards, at least. The majority are small-scale farmers, migrant construction workers, and the main migration destinations in Tasnim are Saudi Arabia and Jordan. In Bahira, Gira village is an older historical village, so a more traditional village in the Egyptians, at least in the sense that it's not a new village like Tasnim. It's 4 times the size, so it's 12,000 members approximately today. And it's a much more stratified social structure. So there's landowners, large-scale landowners, medium-scale and small-scale, traders, and migrant laborers. And the main migration destinations of people from Gira migrate to Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and more previously Libya and Italy, or Italy through Libya, and Libya as well. And I'll talk about a bit about these networks in the rest of the talk. So the research itself was conducted between 2013 to 2018. So throughout the period of my doctoral research. And I first started to conduct research in Tasnim, the much smaller village, the kind of the first case study that I talk about, and then ended up switching to Gira, and kind of my study or my research ended up being conducted in both settings. It was not initially, the project was not initially intended to be a comparative analysis. But this is, I mean, for it actually benefited me, and I find it actually very, this shift ended up, even though it was very hard to do at first, and to try to bring these two contexts together, I think it's proven, or hopefully I hope it has proven to be a very fruitful way to think about this, because especially when thinking about migration, and especially when thinking about rural to transnational migration, there isn't much diversity, I feel, also done when the Nile Delta is addressed or rural is addressed, interrogating what the rural means, interrogating what a rural also means when people are constantly moving back and forth, migrating, investing in the villages. To what extent are they different from the urban? How are they different in the current contemporary context? And also the Nile Delta, where one village is very different than the next, and they might be actually villages very close to each other. Of course, the Delta is very different than Al Said or the south of Egypt, another major agricultural area. So really diversifying this. And also, in a sense, the research ended up not necessarily just the two sites that I used, not necessarily being comparative in a very kind of research sense, but sometimes actually complement each other, where some factors were lacking, where I could not address certain factors in one of the sites, I was able to fill it or complement it in the other site. So the research was mainly quantitative research. So in an anthropological kind of research, fieldwork methods of participant observation, staying long-term in the villages, a minimum of 1 year. And since 2013, spending at least 2 to 3 months a year, every year, in the villages that I researched. And also this long period of time of a really engaged research and being there long-term allowed me to really, I find, see the developments over time, and see a shift even in the villages themselves over time, what was being built, where were people going, who had lost a job, who had got a new job. So this long-term fieldwork really benefited this analysis as well, doing it for a long period of time. The interviews were mostly semi-structured and unstructured. I conducted also focus groups and oral histories, especially in thinking about, for example, in the first village, Tasnim, the new village settled, people who settled in the village in the 50s. At first, what was it like? And so oral histories were very important, also thinking about agricultural developments and what has happened to agriculture and cultivation in a lot of these villages and why, regarding state policies. So oral histories was very important in this regard. And also when talking about these migration networks, where did they first migrate to, why? And for archival research, I also conducted archival research, which was in the dissertation at large, but not necessarily for this chapter, but it was very much part of the research. So for example, when I talk about infrastructure and when I'm talking about like the forms of return investments that get made in the village and in the villages of these, the migrants who are migrating from these villages to the different destinations, I will first talk about what is being invested in the villages, and then I will talk about talking about Tasnim, and then I will talk about Gira next. And then I will think about how these, and then second to that, I will talk about the networks of migration and where they go to, and how these are very much connected. So for example, in Tasnim, there was a lot of, one of the main infrastructure projects that was talked about was, or kind of a main demand by the village was a paving of a 3-kilometer road. And this was basically the village had for almost 2 decades demanded this, or had been in negotiations with the municipal government to build this road to construct it. And its absence, because basically its absence meant that it was a dirt path, unpaved, and also because the village was very much an isolated village. It was very much on the outskirts and furthest away from all the other villages from the main regional road. So it meant that a lot of the villagers who don't have, first of all, transportation was not easy. Microbuses or tuk-tuks or such won't go in and out easily. They wouldn't reach the village. It was very hard to also convince transportation to, or these these different people who want to get to their villages to convince actually to someone to take you there. Not many had, several of the men had motorcycles, but yeah, I mean, mobility was very limited. And also this lack of a road meant other things. It meant that teachers who would come to the school were not willing to come as easily. They would hardly come, they would miss many days. For example, it meant that women were afraid to walk to, if they needed to get out of the village, they were afraid to walk a lot, especially there was a lot of cases of harassment or violence or even thefts, not just for women, but for generally. The kids would have to walk 3 kilometers on this road every day to school and come back. So there was a lot of talk, at least in the narratives of and in the direct experiences of the village and its kind of disconnect and its neglect that it saw and it expressed was very much around this road. And also because the road just meant that trade would be easier. Even just these like moving in and out would be easier. And basically, after 2 decades of trying to negotiate for this road and constantly reaching dead ends with the municipal government, with their village headman, Umda, they were not able to basically reach anything. And as a result, decided to actually start funding for providing this road themselves. And what they ended up doing is, of course, a road construction is a very costly endeavor, especially, it reaches if I'm not mistaken, I can't remember actually the specific figures, but around 3 million Egyptian pounds. For this, between 2 to 3, for this specific road and the budget that they ended up reaching for it or allocating to it. So the village, of course, couldn't fund all of this project, but it ended up providing through a village fund that I will talk about in more depth in a bit, the funds to actually build this road through these, the ability to have these remittances and invest them in the villages. Municipality. So the second project in Tasnim that was also funded partially, at least through these remittances, was a school. And basically the school was also another major infrastructural project where there was an initial school that was built with the village when it was initiated in the 60s, but over time, of course, was not being maintained and ended up being actually very hard to maintain, to continue using. So actually it was very dangerous for the students to use the school anymore. And basically the village, a committee in the village started of these youth kind of in the village, mainly these migrant workers, started to plan towards the building of a new school. And the negotiation or with the municipal government or at least the agreement they reached was that they would also buy the land, so actually pay the cost of the land, and then the armed forces would build the school itself, which is a common practice in a lot of Egypt for these public infrastructures, especially schools, to be built by the armed forces at the time. But of course, this was also not easy. Like it was only until the village had decided that had officially allocated the funds after years of negotiating with the municipal government and demanding, for some form of support in building the school. Only when they started to move and were actually allocating the funds, the government stepped in and decided to help them, or at least continue the building of the school. Another project, for example, was the mosque and a medical unit. So the mosque was also as well a kind of a crumbling structure over the years, and the village, and this is common for a lot of villages, for mosques to be built by funds and aid and different forms of support, generally a collected fund for people to to build a mosque structure, for example. But what was interesting also here is that the village was very much after building the mosque through their this village fund that they used to collect the money from. They ended up planning towards building a medical unit on the second floor. And after the completion of the mosque, had started to collect funds for this medical unit. So we see very so for example. So to talk more about this village fund, it was officially set up in the late 1990s. And it was collected, the money gets collected biannually. So every member of the family, even if it's a kid, is expected to donate a certain amount based on based on their not availability, but their ability, sorry, to fund to provide funds for this money for this collective fund. And it would basically be collected with every major agricultural yield of the season or with the return seasons of these migrants abroad. So for example, when they came back to spend Ramadan in their villages, or when with the temporary kind of circular migration kind of um, routes. Um, so a lot of these, as I said, were as of course a lot of this was invested in actually supporting their families and for their personal use basically, but also very significantly in this village was very much allocating these funds for these infrastructure projects or for the that I just described. Other ways that this income was used was, or this village fund was used was to fund medical services or aid or anyone kind of needing to access urgent medical care. Uh, it was also used to fund, for example, for a new widow who had also lost her son. This is one example. To support her to open up a kiosk. So the money was used to actually supporting her um, to open up a kiosk as a way to support herself. And the kind of social mobilization that happened in Tasnim as a result of this, of these negotiations that I was talking about back and forth, trying to make the government provide these lacking infrastructures for them. And of course, this is not a unique case to Tasnim. A lot of villages in Egypt face this. But what is kind of unique to the case here of Tasnim is this, is what forms of social mobilizations that took place in. So there was a village. So as a result of these demands, the way that they were constantly demanding from the municipal government, these construction of these basic infrastructures was very much, in a sense, as a form of a movement that started in the 90s. It wasn't an official kind of movement that, in the sense that we talk about movements, but it was very much a way of collective action, kind of negotiating, choosing committee heads to talk to different members of the municipality. They also, as a result of, for example, when it came to the road, when they realized that the road negotiations were reaching a deadlock, they dissociated from their Amda, or their village head, Amda as village head. And this Amda was not located in their village, but in a neighboring village, and was initially kind of, so they dissociated from him as a result of claiming claims of nepotism and favoritism, where, for example, he had actually supported or had actually negotiated on behalf of a different village that was actually in much less need of a road being paved, even though it had already a road, over their own village, even though they had been in negotiations for years. And they claimed that he was not representative of the village needs, and basically did not as a mediator for these projects, like the road. And then the municipal government and negotiations had led to a dead end, as I mentioned, and they had instead basically fulfilled their village infrastructures collectively through this fund and through the experiences they had, because a lot of them actually worked as migrant construction workers in Saudi Arabia, mainly, a lot of them from this village. And sorry, something to mention also, so the main destination to Saudi Arabia actually happened in the 80s through one of the village members who was a blacksmith, and then moved to Saudi Arabia and worked in construction work. But then, and eventually, several other members of the village started to follow his path, basically. And then, but at a later stage, in the late 80s, Jordan started to become also a destination for for several of the workers there who either went and worked in agriculture or in security or like guarding buildings and other kind of service, the service economy. So Gira, the other village in Bahira that I talked about, that I initially mentioned, was a much bigger village and is a more kind of traditional village in the sense of, in comparison to Tasnim. A lot of the remittances in Gira were actually invested in land purchases. So in buying land as a form of investment. Also, the most kind of tangibly felt way was in construction of homes. So both residential homes for private and public use. So either for their own family and the increase in family size, they need, of course, new spaces. So a lot of the phenomena of these kind of vertical constructions of buildings that are between 3 to 4 floors high, and also some who have more of a means to invest ended up building these constructions as a way to rent them out, for shops or medical clinics or other small businesses. Um, and then and this is also a phenomenon of this increased building on agricultural land is very much a phenomena that is actually of very great, has been talked about in the media in the last decade, and especially in the current period, a lot around questions of the Qanun al-Tasaluh, or the government's kind of initiatives to kind of deal with what it calls this informal building on agricultural land, and actually the illegality of building on land designated for agricultural use. But in order to understand these kind of why a lot of these farmers are building on the land, not just as a form of investment, but as a form of not being able to use the land for cultivation anymore as a result of these decades of very agricultural policies that actually affect the ability for farmers to be able to benefit from the land for cultivation, and have to use it for other means like building on it and renting it out. So this also has become a main kind of a major phenomenon that's been of much talk recently. So to kind of get more into, just to give you a few case studies before I reach the end of the talk, to think about the kind of migration infrastructures, at least in Gira for this case. So for example, one of my research interlocutors, who I refer to as Adil, was a 40-year-old migrant worker to Italy who went through Libya. And he first attempted to go in the 90s and has been living there since, and coming back to the village on a regular basis, at least once a year or once every 2 years. And he works as a construction worker in Milan. And the kind of throughout the years, the main forms of investments that he's through his migration through his remittances, was in investing first of all in a new home for his family, and also to support his brothers and their family and their marriages. He also built a residential building, maybe like 5 or 6 years later, a residential building where he rented out some of the apartments, for example, a clinic in the village. He has a kiosk at the bottom of the building as a way to also make income, at least. And his brothers are usually taking care of it when he's away, but when he's there, he's also kind of overseeing it. Another case is Anwar, who is 48, and he's a chicken trader in Gira currently. And Anwar is Adil's cousin. However, Anwar tried to follow the same path that Adil took in the 90s and has been taking since, but he was actually very unsuccessful. In 2006, he attempted to go, and he attempted to go through Libya with a cousin and with another village member. And once attempting to, as soon as they got on the boat to heading towards the Italian shore, the boat capsized about an hour after as a result of 30 more people being on the boat, as is a common story. And I'm sure a lot of you have, I don't need to go into detail about this, but the kind of overcrowding of boats and the result of their capsizing. So basically, he ended up spending about 20 hours in the water, 21 hours in the sea. And unfortunately, his cousin did not survive. And it was a very tragic story for him. And until this date, he conceives of it as a failed kind of attempt to, and a loss also of a lot of that he invested and also the sacrifices he made. And of course, the emotional and the mental the emotional costs paid for this. And so as a result, he ended up actually, after being in the water, he reached the Libyan shore, not the Italian shore as he had hoped after being in the water for this long. And he was detained for 4 months, but released prematurely due to extended family connections that were able to get him out early through negotiations that they did. So this is a similar kind of case where people attempt to follow the same routes, but are not as successful for several reasons. And then another case study is Ahmed, who is 55, and he works in a real estate, in the closest city to Gira. So he has actually no longer lives in the village, and as a result of his migration since the 80s, has been able to become more economically secure, and he decided to move his family out of the village. And he invests in land at the village, but he doesn't remain there anymore. And he started to migrate to the United Arab Emirates in the 80s. He initially followed a network of a relative of his, a woman who was married to a migrant to the UAE, but from another village. So she first went, and she was a distant relative of his. Her brother ended up following her. And then, and he used to work in the service, and Ahmed used to work as an accountant in the UAE. And he still, and then I think he returned recently prior to around 2011 and decided to remain in Egypt again. And similar to this story, the similar story that takes place is, for example, migration routes to Saudi Arabia, where, also addressing the gender aspect here, since a lot of this, a lot of talk of rural to transnational migration is usually around migrant male workers. It's important to also talk about the other forms of migration, especially women who migrate as well. So in other cases, for example, from Gira, a teacher who migrated to Saudi Arabia, and then her husband followed, and his brothers, and this ended up over the years also making this connection to Saudi Arabia as a migration destination. And for example, so we see, at least in these 3 case studies, these differential migration infrastructures between informal and formal. So for example, Aidan and Anwar taking the route to Italy, which may have been less costly. So by boat, not by plane, no need for visas or no attempt to get visas or official paperwork, but therefore, as a result of being less costly, is actually a much higher risk. And as we saw with Anwar's almost near to death experience, of course. And then a more formal migration route, where we have Ahmed, for example, as the route to the Gulf, which meant, of course, it's more costly, and therefore the need for investment and the need for the amount of investment put into it is, of course, much higher than the other route, but of course comes with a lower risk. So visas, Guardian, at least in the Saudi Arabian case, the kafil, job offers, plane costs. So it's almost like a trade-off in this case between taking the less costly route or the higher risk route. And of course, also these different routes of migration and these networks, at least in the time that these migrants were able to access these places, was also used as a status difference in the village, and also ways of conceiving of different forms of social mobility, or the aspirations to be socially mobile, to be more economically secure, to be able to afford for the family. And it also became a way for, not just in the aesthetics of the kind of investments in the village, how people started to dress differently, or how they start to build their homes differently, as a way to reflect these migration aspirations and how they have materialized, but also become used as a way to create status differences in the village amongst people. Like, for example, those who claim that those who take the informal route are kind of, migrate illegally. They don't take the official route. They're willing to sacrifice a lot more so it's also become a way to kind of affect the status and social mobility aspect. So to kind of conclude the talk, the physical mobility networks of the migrants are very much affected by the material histories, the social structures, and the geographic locales of the places they emerge from. So, for example, a new village versus an old village, like Tasnim and Gira, whether it's close to the sea or it's more inland, as we see with, for example, Tasnim is much more, as I talked earlier, isolated already, much more isolated in the middle of the fields at the end of the road from the main regional road, as opposed to Gira, which is actually already a very mobile village. It's very close to the Cairo-Alexandria road. It's only within 20 to 30 minutes away from it. The road, yes, is not all paved, but at least it's not as dangerous to be on and out. Transportation gets in easily. So already even the affordances, if we think about mobility, not just the mobility for transnational migration, but already what previous infrastructures of mobility are there that made it easy or not for the villagers to move even in and out of their villages. How easy is it already? For example, in Tasnim, it's very difficult to even just get out and be able to even find, move in and out of the village easily, especially for those who don't have a car or are able to commute easily. So even just thinking about these different layers of mobility or even these different histories of mobility between the villages. Migration also shapes very much the social and political subjectivities of those who migrate. So for example, what I mean by this is how they conceive of their role, their individual community level role, their sense of responsibility, when do they fill in when the state does not, for example, in providing infrastructure projects, their relationship through these negotiations with the state bodies and village and municipal authorities, and very much also the migration experiences themselves. So what experiences, having, for example, taken a boat and migrated and kind of, reaching their centers and the kind of experience of doing that, as opposed to, going through office for job search office that allows you to going with a job offer already, dealing with the visa, the consulate, how these experiences themselves very much shape these subjectivities. And then just to conclude more broadly, is what I try to kind of point to is how these migration stories are embedded in a very complex set of social relationships, attachments, and responsibilities to family members and their communities. So they're very much as there's an attempt to out-migration and aspirations for migrating abroad, it's very much still connected to the locale of their villages of origin or their communities of course. And these remittances are very much seen as being invested back into their villages, where a lot of them are actually for public means and not just for private and individual kind of social mobility attempts or such. So these are some of the points that I hope I have addressed as clearly as possible. But if you have any questions or clarifications, I'd be happy to address. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Nada. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation of a good part of your thesis. Obviously, this is not the entire thesis, as you said, but I guess all the attendees followed with interest your presentation focused on migration, which is our subject. I open the floor now to the attendees to express comments, to raise questions, to seek clarifications from Nada. And you will take down the questions and comments, and then you will comment at the end.
I just want to clarify. I think I said the quantitative research at first, but I meant qualitative. I thought so.
I thought so. I
Yeah, yeah.
thought so. Thank you for clarifying. I see Heba Khalil. Please go ahead. You can also use the raise hand, lower hand function in the program. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Definitely. Thank you. Thank you, Nada, so much for the very interesting presentation. I'm very interested in the different routes of migration that your interlocutors have taken.
Excuse
And
me.
I wonder
Excuse me.
if
Excuse me,
there's a
Heba.
lot of background noise.
Excuse, yes. Please, those who are not speaking, please mute yourselves so that we can hear Heba speak. Go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm wondering about how the destination of migration, or even the fact whether they migrated formally or informally, affects the way the migrants uh, invest in their own villages and in their own infrastructures. For example, do migrant workers who migrate to Cairo or Mansoura or one of the cities in Egypt, are they more likely to perhaps uproot their families and move completely out of the village and stop investing in it than people who migrated to Saudi Arabia or to Kuwait? Have you seen any differences along these lines?
Yeah. So definitely, I think for those who, and I didn't get into as much the actual nationality moving to the village to actually a city, which is very much part of the story as well, as opposed to just moving abroad. But so very much, yeah, I think if the cities are involved, there's much more of an incentive actually to move the family sometimes. I mean, you know, some cases showed that it's a much it's there's this attempt that many do end up moving their families into the municipal city or Mansoura, for example, the actual city. But for others, for example, their families did continue to stay in the village, and they were commuting for work on a daily basis back and forth. But I think interestingly, the kinds of investments and how they're affect. I mean, as a result of so for example, in one the specific case in Tasnim, as a result of actually them still having issues with their land deeds, for example, and their issues with not being able to sell the land easily, for example, because this specifically of its unique history of, or its unique situation of having been these former this kind of reclaimed land or these new settlements in the 50s, and as a result of the kind of um, change of landed policies in the 90s, or tenancy laws, sorry, ended up making them, a lot of them, indebted to the land they already have. So it's very hard, actually, just of this context, to be able to actually sell the land or move to a different context. And basically, the economic kind of difficulties were much more pronounced in Tasnim as a result of this history of theirs. But in Gira, for example, yes, I mean, families did, especially the more skilled laborers, were actually able to move with their whole families, and many of them were able to at least not do that at first, but for the first at least 5 or 6 years, the main person moving to work goes, whether it's the woman or the man, and the whole family continues to follow after. So I guess I would say, I mean, it's a very good question, definitely. And I think I need to think about it more, but I also feel it's very much based on the kind of sense of economic security already in place prior. And how that makes, again, thinking about these risks and these costs of migration, how it's a part of the story. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nada. Other participants, attendees who would like to take the floor, raise questions, make comments. No one. So let me, in this case, until people get more encouraged, let me put a few questions because your presentation made me curious about a few issues. My first question is about the title in your presentation today and in your thesis. Why do you use transnational migration and not international migration? What is the explanation exactly? I'm open, but I'd like to know why did you use this concept? My second question is about Tasnim, because quite interesting, it's a new village, as you said. Where did the inhabitants come from? Did they come from the Aliyah nearby villages, or did they come from somewhere else in Egypt, whether in the Delta or in probably, I think Upper Egypt, but let's say possibly. Obviously, remittances are used in community development. But first, did you find any difference between how remittances are used according to destinations? For instance, migrants who go to Italy, do they invest differently than those who go to Jordan, Saudi Arabia? Larger parts of their income, smaller. In Italy, they can buy property, for instance. They can't do that in Saudi Arabia. Does this have any impact? My following question is, what was the reaction of authority to collective action? Because after all, a common fund and they decide what they want to do. This is what collective action. So how was this received? Did you find any change in the behavior of returnees compared to their behavior before migration? Did you investigate that? Let me stop here and thank you very much for your presentation. And if you wish to answer now, please go ahead. Otherwise, if you want to wait for more questions, you're also welcome to do that.
No, thank you, Doctor, for your questions. Yeah, they're so to think about why I use transnational and not international, I think, I mean, I would be willing to go into more of a discussion of this and actually see what you think. But I think for me, it initially came out of even thinking about, I think about this notion of trans migrants. So very much, and I think this is how the notion of transnational also came in, is thinking about the sometimes a lot of them are the rural to the location outside of the national environment. And thinking, when I talk about trans migrant, I'm thinking about also how their connections at home are very much part of this this network that sometimes trespasses the national boundaries, right? So these connections are sometimes even between the migrants from Gira to or Bahira to Italy, and sometimes they're not, right? They're not taking a kind of you know, the going through the steps of the different national kind of bodies, I think. But I think I need to think. Yeah, I would be, you know, I'd be interested to see why. Maybe if, yeah, but I think my initial use of transnational came from thinking about them as trans migrants, transnational migrants. Yeah. Tasnim, where did they come from? A lot of them, the majority came from neighboring villages, from which were former estate villages, agricultural estate villages, Azbas, from around in the Qahliya as well. But one of the, so they came from eight major family lines and villages. So even when they moved to Tasnim, a lot of them, those different cohorts of families actually were referred to by the name of the initial place they came from. But one of them actually came from south of Egypt, interestingly. So not even from Daqahli at all, but one of them actually came from Said. The remittances and whether they differed, the destination between which countries and how the remittances were. Yeah, of course, like this is why, for example, the case of Adel, when I talk about Italy, he was able, and many examples like him were able to invest in buildings, constructing buildings to actually rent out, as well as buying land, for example. But the cases of Jordan, for example, a lot of them actually came back to not necessarily construct as much, but actually cultivate more. And not just cultivate in the village, but actually for a lot of them also expand into the more desert agricultural kind of sites, right? So cultivating more and actually doing it as buying more places outside of the village, not just in the village. Saudi Arabia, it's mixed, at least because the kind of skills that the people I was talking to, there was very varied skills of those migrating to Saudi Arabia. So the ones in Tasnim were very much either very investing, for example, in family support and the dowries and such, but also in these building of the mosque or building of the road or these kind of examples. While in Gira, it was very much a lot of them actually who went to Saudi Arabia work in kind of the service industry mostly. And so the investments were actually, I would actually have to go back to that and kind of remember what they were invested in mostly. But there's definitely, yeah, it's a good point that there's definitely a difference even in the kind of investments that get done based on the destination country. And of course, about the collective action of the community, this was a long struggle in the community since the 90s. And for many years, they were very much dismissed by the municipal authority. They were seen as, you know, your small scale farmers, you're not, it was a very kind of classist approach and also very kind of, looking down on them as, you know, not being able to even be able to really fulfill their demands and kind of seen as being a nuisance in a sense. But when they actually really pushed up and took the kind of political opportunity to do so in the late 2000s and then also again in 2011 and 12, they were definitely attacked very much. So the first kind of reactions were seen as that they're traitors, that how can you come with this idea yourself? You must be, of course, being kind of moved by outside forces to do this, and you can't have possibly come up with this idea yourself. Someone must have this kind of narrative. They were also, for example, they were very much threatened, and many of them actually faced jail sentences or being detained for their actions. Some have had to leave the village more recently and live abroad, actually migrate to different destinations as a result of this as well, this action in the village. But in fact, a lot of them, others in the village, actually see this push to really get things done. Actually, as much as it might have been, it actually ended up making them being able to fulfill what they needed and these demands they had for many years. So as much as there was a risk and as much as there's this side of story, there's also the side that as much as there's still a long way to go for the development of their village and how they really, these basic necessities, they were able at least to get a lot of it done as a result of this collective action that they wouldn't have been able to otherwise. So yeah, these are my initial reactions to some of the questions, but I'm willing.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very clear. Thank you. Other questions, comments?
There are 2 questions in the chat.
Chat. Let me see.
Oh, so there's Aya Nassar and there's so Aya asks.
And Hayab Johannes, would you like to take the floor to put your questions directly to Nada?
Yeah, sure. Hi. Yes. Hi. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Please go ahead.
Hi. Thank you. Thank you, Nada, for the insightful talk. I have just a brief question, and my question is basically about whether there were some elements of immobilities as well with the migrants. You talked about them moving to some parts of Europe, for instance, Italy, and within Egypt as well. Were there some elements of immobilities, people being stuck somewhere where they wouldn't have all the necessities of life, for instance, to stay, but they were forced to do so because of their own circumstances? And another thing is, why do they move? Is it for economic, political, or other reasons? Why is that? Thank you.
Thank you. So for the forms of immobilities, yes, definitely. I mean, the case that I mentioned is the case of being detained, for example, as an attempt of trying to go to Italy and being detained in Libya, for example, as a result of having gone through this informal route. Different forms of immobilities actually in the destination countries. This is actually, it's a good point to point out. I did not necessarily, or I'm not able to give these examples right now. Like I'm sure it's part of my, but I actually didn't address as much in the dissertation, the immobilities in the places of origin, in the places of destination, sorry, that they go to. But this is definitely an aspect that has to be, that I should pay more attention to when I think about this more. I'm trying to think of the examples now, but yeah, I will have to think about it more. And why do they go? I mean, the main incentive, for a large part, it's become almost like a social, like, I mean, even if you talk about villages today, I mean, primarily economic, right? Economic reasons for migration. For many, it's actually personal aspirations, right? It's part of the attempt to migrate is very much an attempt of having this aspiration for, with their social mobility as a result of not being able to attain jobs in Egypt easily, right? At least in the kind of context that in the villages that these come from, not being able to tap into the social networks as a result of the kind of that would possibly help you in attaining a job. So all of these are part of it, but also very much, I mean, migration has also almost become like a social norm in a lot of these villages today, in the contemporary kind of environment of a lot of these villages, where by the age of, I mean, when male members, especially by the age of, they reach 15, 16, there's already a norm that they would leave the village at first to go to the cities, and then at a later stage to kind of migrate abroad. And it's almost become an expectation for many that they you migrate so, I mean, there's many reasons, right? Depending on the different case studies, but a primary reason is, of course, the economic reason, social mobility, and generally aspirations for a better future. And so I think the written questions.
I think we'll ask Aya to put her question directly to you. Aya Nassar, please.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. Hi, Nada. Congratulations on on the PhD, and it's great to be hearing about your research as well. So my question, and my apologies if that was something you covered before I came in because I was late joining, but if you care or if you'd like to expand a little bit on the material and materiality aspect of infrastructure, I mean, this is where my interests lie, and I know that you pick that up as a theme also in your work, and I was basically captivated by the part that you speak about the dirt and how dirt or the establishing of a proper road sort of creates the dynamics and conflicts about mobility, but not just mobility, but also affective and attachment to infrastructure as well. So if you kind of feel like if there are lots of other insights as well about the question of materiality of infrastructure, and that you'd care to elaborate on, that would be great. But other than that, it's great. It's great to hear about the research, and it's great to hear about this presentation as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Aya, very much for your question. It's nice to see you. Thank you for coming. This is definitely an aspect that I address at large in the other chapter, or I didn't get into much depth into this talk, but very much about the materiality of the infrastructure, right? I also try to talk about, for example, the building of a road, how it's very much or these migration networks even as very much a kind of a fluid infrastructure or ability to move in and out easily. A road, what it does, but also a road as being very much a concrete, right, structure, like it's paving and cement and actually also, for example, like something that I do in a different chapter is very much talking about in this process of paving the road. At first, there was only one section of the road that was constructed and the rest of the road was not completed, and how this created accidents, for example. So even when they finally got some of the funds to construct the road, they couldn't do it all at once. It failed. It actually failed a lot because in order to construct the road, you have to do it all at once, or else what you've built will keep getting chipped away with the cars coming in and out. So very much how this reflected for the community again. This very much kind of embodied experience of commuting on this even half cemented, right, half paved, road. The kind of, again, the kind of government's attempt to just perform that they're investing money and not actually really looking towards the kind of, like real benefit of the, like just performing that it's constructing here, we built you a section, but in fact, what does a section do in the end? It's actually can be إهدار ملاعين, like wasting public funds because you actually, it's a failed project again. So very much this materiality of it reflects very much again the social kind of neglect and of course aesthetically also the materiality of, for example, the buildings that these, in the Migrat, for example, the buildings that are built as a result of these these remittances back in the village, and how even we can go a lot into taste and how the buildings start to look, a lot of people, this is of course Farha Ghanem and other people have talked about this. I don't do it as much, but like thinking about how the look of the houses themselves take difference. So for example, how there was a house built in the village that was marble from the outside. There was these propelled like horse statues from the outside, flower pots, and when I try to analyze somewhat why a lot of this gets done, it's not just, a lot of people say it's for them to show off and it's a way to to show wealth and things like this, but it's actually also a representation of for a lot of them it was actually how they conceive of other people in the villages, expectation of them. You've gone to abroad, you've seen a different style, and now we want you, we expect you to, having experienced this, has gone abroad and done this, to kind of, build your house this way. And even though, of course, when they live abroad, they live in a house, an apartment with 20 other members, of course, they don't live in these marble or horse statue houses, or ceramic from the outside, but it's very much an expectation of also a social expectation of how they conceive of others seeing them, as much as not just a way to show off, right? These are some two examples, but I can think about more for a later stage too. Yeah.
Or is it a way of connecting the villagers whenever migrated to that outside world to which the migrants have gone? So
exactly.
Your answer suggests to me that this could also seen as a way for the villagers to participate in the migration experience.
Exactly, yeah. It's very true.
And to have some of the culture that they supposedly have gained. Interesting. Yes. Very interesting. Other questions, comments? Carlos, would you have any question? Or would you like to seek any clarification?
No, doctor, everything was good. Thank you very much.
I think Sarah raised her hand.
Aziz, do you have anything to say, Aziz? Or
I
Bianca?
Sarah Sadiq has a raised hand.
Who raised hand?
Sarah.
Someone?
I think Sarah Sadiq wants to ask a question.
Sarah, yes. Go ahead, Sarah.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Nada. And sorry again, Nada, if also you might have touched partially upon that. But you have mentioned also some of the countries, one of them was Libya, for example. And I see that you've also touched upon those who have returned. And I was wondering whether this notion of, circular migration, or those who have been more than once to these countries, to any of these countries, is something that you've come across, and is something that have had any impact, whether in terms of their, avenues back home, or resistance, etc., or you haven't really touched upon that. So that's the first part of my question. And the second question is also complementing what Dr. Ibrahim has already posed earlier in terms of remittances. Have you also came across any of those so-called social remittances? And these are not really my terms, but I would advise that you read to someone called Peggy Levitt, who have talked about also social remittances in terms of transforming norms, etc. Has this been something observed also in your thesis beyond the purely economic remittances? Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Your first question is a very complex one, and it's one I wished I would have actually, I've become more conscious of it after actually completing, or towards the end of writing up my dissertation. The return migrants from Libya, at least return migrants, and these different dynamics that they take on after. But I'm, unfortunately, I don't think I have, anything to say to it now. But for further research, definitely. Which is important to pay attention to, definitely. Social remittances, yes, of course. The whole political subjective or social subjectivities that I talks about, and I wrote about, of course, engaging with Peggy Levitt and the kinds of social remittances. And I see very much that actually a part of this, the experience, for example, of this collective action in one village of Tasneem, sorry. Is very much embodied in their experiences of actually being this new village, of initiating the villages themselves, of cultivating the land for 10 years before it, provided any agricultural yield. But also it's very much actually later part, these migration experiences also very much inform their experience, their need for this collective kind of move. And for example, even not just international whatever, like going abroad for the cases that I talk about, but for example, several in the village, just even studying in Mansoura University, and the kind of, and one of them is a lawyer, for example. So very much the kind of, and end up being a lawyer, and a lot of the cases he takes up are about public funds and corruption and things like this. So in Mansoura city, and so even just mobility to even city and being part of these environments, very much part of the kind of social remittances they brought back, and the kind of even community development aspects that happened. I see very much connected to mobility at large.
Nada, let me ask you a question to follow up on what Sarah just said. And I had asked you about change of behavior after return, which is about social remittances. But let me put this question to you. Would a change in the behavior, or let's say a behavior in Tasneem different than behavior in nearby villages, would it be explained by migration only? Or can you also factor in the fact that this is a village of the 1950s, 60s, of another era of mobilization in Egyptian society? The mere fact that inhabitants moved from other villages to this new settlement, the mobilization discourse of that period, did that contribute to a culture different than the culture of nearby and surrounding villages?
Of course, this is a very good point, Dr. Ria. Of course, this is part of even how a lot of the oral histories that I conducted, especially with the older members who are still alive today and were the first people to move to the village and cultivate it, is very much this revolutionary anecdote. Like, we are a Nasserist project village. We, as much as they find complexity actually in the project of Nasser, they still very much conceive of themselves as the subjects of this reform and the subject of this first this era and this this experience, sorry, of being part of a Nasserist social model village also. And they see themselves very much connected to this revolutionary history of the country at the time, which very much, and also the experience of having kind of, as they see, being paid the price of, moving from all other villages, actually moving to a village. And even though the village was constructed, it was very difficult to move to a new village and cultivate the land there. And they went through a lot of difficulties for the first 10 years and they see this struggle as very much part of their actually ability to depend on themselves in the end. They've learned these skills from early on. This is how they conceive of it. As opposed to Gira, for example, they've always been a somewhat government-aligned village, government-supported, at least in the case of Tasnim, sorry, just to go back, especially when the Nasserist project no longer, we moved beyond the Nasser era and moved into open market, open door kind of, and this project of these, the land even reform itself was not really fully realized. The village itself became very much neglected as a result of this. This experience of neglect was very much also connected to the experience of the village being this socialist experiment in a sense, and then not kind of succeeding from it and moving beyond that also. So a large part of this neglect is very much a direct experience of this transformation. In Gira, the kind of social networks, the ability to the connections of many people in the village to different kind of government authorities and ministries and even municipal government affects very much also the ability to that this kind of collective action is there, but not in the same way. It's very much done through accessing these networks of people who can get things done free to a certain extent, that these networks were not there given the kind of social makeup in Tasnim. So very much, yeah, these histories are very much, and these kind of social contexts of the two villages very much dictate this as well, definitely.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nada. Questions? Comments? Would Mai Shokri like to say something? Apparently not. Anyone else? Well, in this case, we'll give the floor again to say a few words so as to put an end to the webinar. Go ahead, Nada, what would you like to add?
What would I like to add? I mean, this has been very useful for me too, because I'm really thinking now about, trying to think about publications and how to even refine a lot of my, the things I talk about. So this was very useful for me, especially doing this. I haven't done it in a, migration expert kind of group but I'm, attempting to get more into this now. So I'm very happy to kind of get these questions and think more about this. I will definitely be using a lot of the things we talked about today or the questions for further research or even analysis. Yeah. So thank you very much for everyone's participation.
I think that the participants will join me in thanking you for the presentation and thanking you for your reactions to questions, to comments that were made. And I think you need to also be commended for the thesis that you researched and wrote and working on two villages, one to the west of the delta, one to the east of the delta, and looking at their collective action and looking at migration originating in these villages and the culture that has developed. Because in one of your answers, you said that as young people reach a certain age, they start thinking of migration. So it has become part of the culture of villages in Lower Egypt. You said that they think of migrating to the cities and then abroad. But I guess there also is direct migration from the villages to external labor markets. Also, it happens. So these are things that are relatively new, in fact, in Egypt. They go back probably 50 years. So society moves, evolves, and we're lucky to have researchers like you to track this evolution and this movement, which we hope will be accelerated towards a better economic and social environment, better economic and social and political standards of living. Thank you very much. Thanks very much to all the participants who have made us the pleasure and the honor of being here today. And again, thank you very much, Nada, and we look forward to being all together again in the next CMRS webinar. Good afternoon to all.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.